Welcome to another video. So this video is for the class 12 GSEB, that is a Gujarat board, and this subject is of psychology, and the chapter name is this is the second chapter, and this chapter name is the learning skills. So now I'm going to start this chapter by reading it. So psychology is a science of a behavior. In recent study, it has been found that every living being on earth has to learn to adapt to the surrounding environment, and it is an inevitable process. Every living being, for his own safety and sustainment, has to learn something or the other skills. Learning brings change in a behavior and situation and helps a man to solve different types of problems. It can be said that the human being can live freely, safely, and with satisfaction only because of the skill of learning. So every human being during his lifespan behaves in a two ways. That is, the first way is uh, natural behavior. Second way is the learned behavior. So there is no need for any kind of a formal education for natural learning. At the time of the birth, a human baby is capable of making only a limited number of response, which can be termed as in a born or natural behavior. For example, an ant pulling a grain for its survival. A newborn calf immediately start suckling its mother. A cry of a baby immediately after it born can all said to be a inborn responses. So normally every living being, to satisfy its basic needs and safeguard itself, gives out a natural responses to the environment, which we can call as a natural behavior. Learned behavior means that learning which takes place by observing others or is to taught an individual by other people or stimulus in the environment. Whenever a man or an animal learns something, there is a change in one's behavior. But if this behavior change occurs as a result of experience or the practice, then only it can be called as learning. It's a natural for the child as he or she grows and matures, brings a change in his behavior pattern because of his experiences from the environment and also learn to adapt to the situation. Hence, it can be said that the learning is a continuous process from the birth till to death. So an individual in his childhood acquires a basic learning either by modeling or by trial and error. In adolescence, his learning is based on the conditioning, whereas a problem in your youth are solved by his learning and experiences of the past and its insightful application in the present situation. So it can be said that the person can learn language, behavior, attitude, discipline, etc. through education with the education and develop his personality. So an individual can sail through the ocean of a life successfully with the help of a learning and education. So what is learning? And the definition and its explanation. According to the American psychologist C.T. Morgan, learning is any relatively permanent change in a human or animal behavior as a result of experience or practice. I am repeating again. According to the C.T. Morgan, he is a psychologist. According to him, learning is any relatively permanent change in human or animal behavior as a result of experience or practice. This definition throws a light on three important points in learning process, that is the experience and practice, change in a behavior, relatively permanent change. So these are the three points which are throws the light on three important points in the learning process. So let us understand in a detail the above features of the definition of a learning. So which means the 3 points which I just read, we will discuss all these three in detail in this paragraph. So experience and practice. Whenever man or animal learns something, there is a change in a behavior. But if the behavioral change is not by training, experience, or practice, then it cannot be called as learning. One should note that the behavioral changes also occur due to the maturity, tiredness, disease, injury, etc. But such behavior changes also cannot be called learning. For example, as the child grows old, it learns to crawl or turn upside down, but this learning is because of growth and maturity. Hence, the psychologists do not accept it as the learning process of a learning. In the same process, in the same way, when we cannot stand properly due to the exhaustion or breaking of a bone due to the injury and not being able to walk properly cannot be called a learning. Any behavioral change that takes place by practice or experience can be called a learning. Now, the second one is change in a behavior. It can be called a learning only when it brings change in a behavior pattern of the individual. That is, a child who does not know how to ride a bicycle will fall down when he tries to ride it for the first time. But with training and practice, the child will learn to keep balance, paddle slowly, and learn to ride bicycle. This example clarifies that learning brings about a change in a behavior. And the third one is relatively permanent change. The behavioral changes produced by a learning are relatively permanent. The behavioral changes that are temporary, which occur because of the fatigue, drug, or the disease, cannot be called as a learning. So it was found in the above example that due to exhaustion, man cannot walk properly, but after the exhaustion, when we can walk properly, then such a cannot be called as a learning. Instant behavioral changes which are temporary are not accepted by a psychologist as a learning. Only those changes which are for a long time and are relatively permanent are accepted as a learning. That is, when child tries to ride a bicycle for the first time, he falls down, but with the practice for some days, he learns to ride the bicycle and also go to school. This is called a relatively permanent change in a behavior of to the learning. So how do we call a learn? How do we learn? So after getting the idea about learning, the most important question that arises in the mind is that how does learning take place? Right? So different types of research have been done by expert psychologists in relation to this. Many researches and experiments have been performed on humans and animals to see how learning takes place. Out of many, we are going to study the 5 experiments in details. So first is learning by emulation, modeling and limitation. So most of the learning done by the human child or the animal is because of the limitation or the emulation. Learning by emulation is called the observational or the social learning. Observation is the most important source of emulation. An individual learns through the observation from its surrounding environment and then emulates it, that is, a child imitating the act of filling petrol in its tricycle just as parents do it in scooter, or trying to fill air in the cycle wheel and also giving money, etc. All these are examples of a behavioral patterns practiced by the children because of a learning by emulation. And a 1-year-old child putting a mobile phone near the ear and talking is an example of a learning by emulation. There are a lot of examples which we can get from our daily life and social surroundings, and so this is called the social learning. While watching a TV, a young girls imitate the dressing style and cosmetic usage just like the actress. This can be called the example of a learning by modeling. So, moving forward, the second experiment of the learning is learning by trial and error. This experiment is done by the Thorndike. So this is the very important experiment which can be asked in the question in the question paper. So American psychologist Thorndike had prepared a puzzle box in such a way that when the lever inside the box is pressed, then only the door will open. So experiment by the Thorndike. Thorndike put a hungry cat in a puzzle box and put food just outside the box in such a way that it can be seen by a hungry cat. The cat tried to come out of the puzzle box to get the food, and for that it tried very hard. At first, it started scratching and pulling at the bars of the puzzle box, roamed about in the puzzle box, etc. It was trying to come out of the puzzle box, but it was not successful. The cat again practiced the same kind of a behavior. Eventually, the cat accidentally happened to press the lever and the door of the puzzle box opened. Here, the pressing of a lever by the cat was accidental, and it was not aware that the pressing of the lever had opened the door. So when the cat was again put back in the box, it went through a series of incorrect responses before pushing the lever. In this way, the Thorndike continued the experiment for the 24 days and 24th trial. When the hungry cat was put in the puzzle box, it immediately pressed the lever and came out of the box. Here, the cat had learned to perform the act of pressing the lever to open the door. Basically, in a trial and error learning, as the trial increases, the time taken to learn and the errors both decreases. In the above experiment also, in the first trial, the cat took 160 seconds to press the lever and open the door, whereas in the 24th trial, it took just 10 seconds to press the lever and open the door. The cat became progressively quicker at the escaping from the puzzle box. Hence, in a trial and error learning, as a trial increases, errors decreases, and finally the learning takes place without any error. So the third experiment is learning by conditioning. Learning by conditioning means to associate. It is a pattern of learning based on association, and it is the simplest method of learning. More frequent and predictable response given to a stimuli in a given situation or environment can be called as a conditioning. Again, it is a pattern of learning based on association, and it is the simplest method of learning. More frequent and predictable response given to a stimuli in the given situation or environment can be called as a conditioning. That is, a different sound of the school bell is associated with the different activities. So in this kind of a learning, an individual experiences a series of a sensation in the brain and so on presentation of a particular stimuli. It evokes and response associated with it. In this way, we can say that the conditioning means a series of experience in which presence of a stimulus also make us realize the presence of a many associated stimuli. The first investigator of this type of learning was Russian psychologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. He was born in 1849 and he died at the 1936. And he was primarily interested in the physiological aspect of a digestion. And traditionally, conditioning is also called as classical conditioning. So first experiment on classical conditioning. The Russian psychologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was primarily interested in the study of digestion. To satisfy his curiosity, he conducted various experiments on dogs, during which he gained a lot of information on conditioning, and psychologists got the gift of a classical conditioning from the Pavlov. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for psychology, physiology, and medicines in the 1904. The Pavlov designed a special stand on which a dog was harnessed in such a way that a dripping saliva would fall in the measuring glass. Firstly, the Pavlov presented food before the hungry dog, and the dog started salivating, which was a very natural response. Now, a bell was sounded, followed by serving of food to the dog. This was repeated for some days. After a few such trials, the taste trail was introduced in which everything was the same except the presentation of food. In the beginning, the salivary response was noticed in the response to a food, but afterwards, the saliva started to secrete in the presence of a sound bell only. Now, only the sound bell, and the dog started salivating. Pavlov did not stop the experiment here, but he brought about changes in the presentation of a stimuli to study in-depth learning of a classical conditioning. So, important feature of classical conditioning. The above experiment explained in an easier way Pavlov's classical conditioning, but being a student of psychology, it is necessary to know important terms used in it. Unconditioned stimulus, that is a UCS. So, in the in the basic terms, the stimulus which produces the response which is unlearned, natural, and not taught is called unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, when a food is presented to a hungry dog, it started salivating, which is a natural response, and so here the food is said to be a unconditioned stimulus. The second is the unconditioned response, that is the UCR. Any response which is not associated, learned, or conditioned cannot be called as a learned response. So, any kind of a physiological response which is unlearned is known as the unconditioned response. In short, natural response to a natural stimuli is called a UCR. In Pavlov's experiment, salivation is a natural response by the dog on seeing the food, that is a UCS. The response of salivation is UCR. Now, the third is the conditioned stimulation. Usually, the conditioned stimulus is a natural stimulus. It can be said that the stimulus which is presented with the unconditioned stimulus, and it helps in eliciting an unconditioned response, then that stimulus is called a conditioned stimulus. In initial trials of the Pavlov's experiment, it was found that the dog started salivating on seeing the food. After the few trials, the first bell was sounded and the food was presented, and it was noticed that the saliva started to secrete at the sound of the bell only, which signifies that learning had taken place in the dog. So the stimulus that can elicit an conditioned response is called a conditioned stimulus. Moving forward, the conditioned response. The response which was not associated with a particular stimulus before, but after the learning and practice, when conditioned stimulus is presented, it elicits a conditioned response, that is a salivation. So in Pavlov's experiment, when the sound of a bell made the dog salivate, it became conditioned response, that is a CR. So before conditioning, the food is the UCS and salivation is the UCR. During the conditioning, the sound bell is a CS, which is the conditioned stimulation plus food, that is the unconditioned stimulation, and the salivation will be the unconditioned response. After conditioning, the bell is a conditioned stimulation, and a salivation is a establishing condition, that is the EC, establishment of conditioning. So the reinforcement refers to the administration of the reinforcement by an experimenter. Reinforcer is any stimulus which strengthens the response. In Pavlov's experiment, food was the reinforcer. Extension: if the conditioned response is not reinforced, that is unconditioned stimulus is not presented continuously for several trials along with the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response slows down gradually and ultimately stops. This is called the extension. The stimulus generalization. After the establishment of the conditioning, the conditioned response also occur by the other stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. It is called a generalization. In Pavlov's experiment, after the establishment of the conditioning of the salivary response to a bell, the dog used to salivate to sound of the electric buzzer and the sound of a metronome Also, stimulus discrimination. To be able to differentiate between the stimuli and also learn to respond to one stimuli in one way and the other stimuli in the other way is called stimulus discrimination. After the stimulus generalization, if the food follows the sound of a bell only and does not follow the sound of the buzzer, then a dog learns to differentiate between the two sounds. That means the saliva is secreted only at the sound of a bell and not by the sound of a buzzer. If this is repeated, then slowly the dog will stop salivating at the sound of a buzzer because it has learned to differentiate between the two sounds. The Skinner's experiment of operant conditioning. Just as Pavlov gave us the gift of classical conditioning, in the same way, American psychologist B.F. Skinner gave us the gift of learning by operant conditioning. This study is slightly different from the Pavlov's. In classical conditioning, man did not do any activity, yet he used to get reinforcement, while in operant conditioning, subject will have to perform some specific activity to get reinforcement. So reinforcement means the food or any other object which the person or the man have to achieve it. So he studied the conditioning voluntary responses which are under the control of an animal or a man. The subject will operate on environment and it is called the operant. In this type of conditioning, man or animal has to perform a task decided by the experimenter. So this type of learning is called instrumental conditioning. So, as per this B.F. Skinner's experiment, by giving the reinforcement, whatever desired behavior is to be taught can be done easily. For his experiment, Skinner prepared a puzzle box which was called the Skinner's box. And the Skinner box was specially designed in such a way that the rat can move inside the box but cannot come out. There was a bar in the box which was connected with the food container kept on the top. When the bar was pressed, the food pellet would drop in the food tray. A hungry rat was placed in the Skinner's box. In the beginning of the rat kept on the moving inside the box as it could not come out. It started pulling at the bar of the box, biting it, running here and there, etc. But while moving around and pawing the walls, that is explorative behavior, and the hungry rat accidentally pressed the bar and food pellet dropped into the food tray. The hungry rat ate it up in the next trial. The explorative behavior started again, and the rat again accidentally pressed the bar and food pellet dropped. So, in the first trial, the rat got the food pellet after the 15 minutes in the box. The second food pellet was obtained after the 35 minutes, which means that it got the food pellet after the 20 minutes in the first trials. In the same way, the third food pellet was obtained by the rat after the 47 minutes and the fourth was after the 71 minutes. As the number of the trials increased, the rat learned to press the bar to get food in lesser and lesser time. Now when the hungry rat was placed in the Skinner's box, it immediately pressed the bar and got the food plate. Here the bar pressing is an operant response and food is its reinforcement. In the above experiment, the bar pressing response is instrumental in getting the food. Hence, this type of a learning is also known as instrumental conditioning. Hence, in operant conditioning, the rat accidentally learned to press the bar in the beginning, but a reinforcement learning took place. So, determinants of operant conditioning. Reinforcement, it may be defined as any stimuli or event which increase the probability of the occurrence of the response. Any behavior that is learned or changed through their consequences are called as a reinforcer. In classical conditioning, the food is reinforcement because of which the dog learned to salivate, whereas in operant conditioning, the rat learns to press the bar because the food pellet was the reinforcement. Reinforcement is two types. That is, the first is positive reinforcement and the second is negative reinforcement. The first, positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is a stimulus which increases the probability of the response when presented after the response. It increases the rate of a response that precedes its presentation. For Skinner's, hungry rat gets food plate after it presses the bar. As a result, the probability of a bar pressing response increases. Positive reinforcers have a pleasant sequence as they got strengthened and they maintain the response upon which they are contingent. That is, a mother giving a chocolate to her child on finishing his homework. Chocolate is the positive reinforcement for the child. Negative reinforcement. Generally, the positive reinforcement is looked upon as a reward, while the negative reinforcement has a punishment. But as per the Skinner's, negative reinforcement cannot be considered as a punishment. Negative reinforcer is a stimulus which increases the probability of a response when removed after the response. So if the bar systematically used, it can lead to desired response. In operant conditioning, the negative reinforcement is not used as punishment, but to increase the probability of escape or avoidance response. In Skinner's experiment, supposing the pressing of the bar would have given the relief from the electric shock to the rat than to come out of the painful situation. The rat would have learned to press the bar. Again, in operant conditioning, negative reinforcement is not used as punishment but to increase the probability of escape or avoidance response. In Skinner's experiment, supposing the pressing of the bar would have given the relief from the electric shock to the rat than to come out of the painful situation, the rat would have learned to press the bar. Reinforcement can be a positive or a negative, but it can called be as reinforcement only when it increases the probability of desired response in a man or animal. In operant conditioning, a Skinner's tested the effect of reinforcement on rat by changing the number, amount, and quality of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement, delayed reinforcement, etc. See how effective the conditioning takes place. Extinction. When an unlearned response gradually becomes slow and ultimately stops, then it is called as extinction. After having learned the response, if the animal is not given a reinforcement through it does the activity of responding, then it completely stops. It called as the extinction. After learning to operate an instrument in the form of response, if the animal is not given the reinforcement for the many trials, then slowly the animal stops giving the learned response and then totally stops. It means the established conditioning gets extinct. If in the Skinner's box, the rat has learned to press the bar to get the food pellet, and now if the rat presses the bar again and again but the food plate is not given, then the rate of pressing the bar is reduced and it also stops at the end. Thus the conditioned operant response extinguishes in the absence of reinforcement. The stimulus generalization. Just as we have seen the stimulus generalization in a classical conditioning, it's not possible in operant conditioning. Because in this type of a conditioning, the Skinner's box is the main stimulus, but there are a lot of example of a stimulus generalization in our daily life. That is, if you hide the toy of the child in a particular place, at first the child it will search for it randomly and accidentally be able to find it. But when this is done again and again, then the child will not search for it, but it will immediately go to that place and find the toy. This activity of the child takes place because of the conditioning. Now, even if the place is changed to hide the toy, the child will be able to find it in no time, as it will associate the old place with the new place, and this takes place because of a stimulus generalization. Now, the stimulus discrimination. In operant conditioning experiment, the rat is taught to differentiate between the two stimulus, that is the presence of a light and absence of a light. If the rat presses the bar in the presence of a light, it will get the food plate, and if it presses the bar in the absence of a light, then no food plate for the rat. After the few trials, the rat learned to discriminate between the presence and absence of light. So the rat used to press the bar only in the presence of a light. It was because of a learning to discriminate between the stimuli. The fifth experiment, learning by insight. So learning by insight is a comprehensive act of processing a learning in which the man or animal have an abrupt or the sudden realization of a problem solution because of their own insight. German Gestalt psychologist Wolfgang Kohler was the first one to conduct the experiment which led to development of the first cognitive theories of learning. During the World War, he performed the experiment on apes and studied their behavior on Canary Land. His contribution in the theory of learning by insight is remarkable. According to the Kohler, insight learning is not the result of a trial and error or the observing someone else attempting the problem, but it depends on the individual or animal's ability to visualize the problem internally and to respond to it. Following the occurrence of insight, the realization of how to solve the problem can be repeated in a future similar situation once learning takes place. The Kohler's experiment on chimpanzees. According to the principle of evolution, lower level animal learn by limitation, but a higher level animal learning can take place because of insight and conditioning. To study a learning by insight, Kohler made use of a chimpanzee because, as per the theory of evolution, they have the same structures of a brain as the humans have. He tried to study and observe how the chimpanzees tried to solve the problem, and so let's study a few his experiment in details. So, experiment with the one stick. Kohler has performed the different experiment on chimpanzees where there are the simple to complex problem situation. In this experiment, he has tried to observe how the chimpanzees solve a very simple problem. He put a hungry chimpanzees in the cage and put a bunch of bananas just outside the cage so that the chimpanzees can see it, and he also put a stick in the portion of the cage back portion of the cage. It was obvious that the chimpanzees tried very hard to reach the bananas by pushing his hand and outside the cage. He tried it with the legs and so on, but he was not successful, so he stopped doing any activity and sat down in the cage. Suddenly, he saw the stick and he took the stick, went in front of the cage and pulled the bananas towards it with the stick. In this way, the chimp succeeded in solving the problem by sudden insight when he saw the stick. Experiment with the two sticks. In this experiment, he posed a slightly difficult problem in front of the chimpanzee. This time, he put a bunch of bananas a little further away than the first time. Inside the cage, he put two sticks made in such a way that the both can be joined to make one long stick. When the hungry chimp was put in the cage, it started its exploratory behavior, but as soon as he saw the short stick, he immediately tried to pull the bananas with the stick but was not successful in reaching it. He tried very hard to get bananas with the long stick but was not able to get it. He then gave up it and started playing with the two stick. Suddenly, while playing, he happened to place the small into the long stick to make one very long stick. As soon he joined the sticks, he realized that now he can reach the bananas. In this way, a slightly difficult problem was also solved by chimpanzees because of this insight. Experiment with the boxes. Kohler tried to test whether the insightful learning can take place in a learning in chimpanzee to solve a complex problem. In this experiment, Kohler put three boxes in the high ceiling room and he hung a bunch of bananas from the ceiling in the middle of the room. When the hungry chimp was put in the room, he started jumping to get the bananas. He tried very hard, but all was in vain. Ultimately, he saw the boxes which were there in the room. He put the box in the middle of the room, claimed on it, and get the bananas. One by one tried with all the three boxes, but as he was not succeeded in getting the bananas, he became sad. He kept on looking at the boxes. Suddenly, by inside, the chimpanzee pulled the boxes in the three in the middle of a room and started stacking in it on each other. For the first few minutes, he was not able to arrange it properly, but the chimpanzee did not give up. He tried it till he was able to arrange the boxes one upon another perfectly so that he could climb and reach the hanging bananas. Kohler clearly tries to make us understand that how chimpanzees' early learning helped him to solve his problem by making use of available instruments or tools. According to a Kohler, the process of solving a problem in a new situation begins with new trial and error, but later on with learning. It tries to apply it in solving the problem. According to psychologist Harlow, insight cannot take place with past learning. Inside learning happens regularly in our lives and all around us. Invention and innovation alike are oftentimes the result of inside learning. It is called Eureka or the aha experience. Inside learning is also called as out of the box thinking. Hence, learning Hence, learning solve a problem. If the problem situation is arranged in an organized way, then it takes us to closer the solution, and then by insight, the problem can be solved. In this way, every living being on this earth to survive adapt to the surrounding environment with the some or other kind of a learning process. Mostly every learning living being uses more than one kind of a learning skills to live a life. So by this, the learning skills, the chapter learning skills end here. So I will get to the another video. Till this, have a good day. Keep learning, keep reading, keep studying. Bye.